Ah, convenient timing, because I'm at the hour. Hey, Abby. Good to have you. Ooh. And now the lamp is over my face. Hey, Abby. Yeah, doing pretty well, Just, what you call it? What am I doing today? That's a good question. It's just been one of those days where, you do a bunch of stuff and then you can't really bring to mind anything that you've done. You pass the day by, you're doing your sort of regular thing, and then you run into one of them curse books that sort of messes with your mind, and you're sort of trapped in you're like a hellscape of sort of mental shifting planes and angles, and you don't know where you've been or what you've done. I mean, Fridays, am I right? I gotta stop going down that one corridor. Anyway, but so. For anyone who is not Abbe, who's in the chat, and who isn't familiar, hello, my name is SkitterSkreetch, you can call me Skitter, and as you might have been able to establish a little bit by context there, I'm a rat who is trapped inside of a large cursed library full of many, many cursed books, and other books as well. And what I do is I read some of those other books, and once one of the cursed ones by accident, there's not really an and to that statement. I read those books, and that's what we do here. I guess that and is what we do here. Anyway, but yeah, so we're in a library. This is again not the old library, just a section of it. And I get books from out of that library, and I bring them to here, and then we read them. And that's the conceit. That's what we do here. I don't know why I feel the need to explain it every time, but I feel like people just don't really kind of grasp. Like, it's a very strange thing for a lot of people. Anyway, but for those of you who do grasp it. Today we're going to be doing a couple of them. After doing Metamorphosis by Kafka yesterday, I've quite enjoyed him, so I think we're going to do... This isn't Kafka. We're going to do one more of his. The Great Wall of China, which is a fair bit shorter, so hopefully it won't take quite so long. And because I don't think it's going to be enough to do like a full hour's worth of stream, which is what I'm aiming for around about today, we're also going to do the leftover M.R. James Ghost Story, number 13. I don't particularly mind which order there is, so if anyone wants one or the other first, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I'll probably start with a Kafka, but yeah. And for anyone, again, as always, if I read through, while I'm reading through something, you've missed something, or you want me to go back, or there's a bit of stream lag or whatever, let me know. I'm always happy to go over something again. And same if you have any questions, comments. These are both reasonably short stories today, so I'll probably be going over the like them and doing my little bit of literary analysis after the fact. And yeah, I think that's about all I have to say, really. What else? I don't know. I mean, I'm hopeful that today's this Kafka is also going to be about VTubers. After I was surprised to learn that the Metamorphosis was about someone becoming a VTuber. Interesting. I'm wondering if there's much more of that represented in fiction. But yeah, I'm hoping that this will be about that, but it says it's about a wall. And I don't think there are any wall VTubers. I mean, there might be. But we'll find out. But yeah. I'm sort of stalling now, because I said if anyone wants me to do something, then I'm like, well, I've got to give you a minute to like be like, oh, do you want to do that? But I don't think anyone's going to answer, so... that being the case, then without further ado, I shall begin with the Great Wall of China. Yeah. The Great Wall of China was finished off at its northernmost corner. From the southeast end and from the southeast and the southwest, it came up in two sections that finally converged there. This principle of piecemeal construction was also applied on a smaller scale by both the two great armies of labour, the eastern and the western. It was done this way. Gangs of some 20 workers were formed who had to accomplish a length, say of 500 yards of wall, while a similar gang built another stretch of the same length to meet the first. But after the junction had been made, the construction of the wall was not carried out on from the point, let's say, where this 1,000 yards ended. Instead, the two groups of workers were transferred to begin building again in quite different neighbourhoods. Naturally, in this way, many great gaps were left, which were only filled in gradually and bit by bit, some indeed not till after the official announcement that the wall was finished. In fact, it is said that there are gaps which have never been filled in at all, an assertion, however, which is probably merely one of the many legends to which the building of the wall gave rise, which cannot be verified, at least by any single man with his own eyes and judgment, on account of the extent of the structure. Now, in the thoughts one might conceive that it would have been more advantageous than everywhere to build the wall continuously, or at least continuously within the two main divisions. After all, the wall were intended, as we universally proclaimed and known, to be a protection against the peoples of the north. But how can a wall protect, if it is not a continuous structure? Not only cannot such a wall protect, but what there is of it is in perpetual danger. These blocks of wall left standing in deserted regions could easily be pulled down again and again by the nomads, especially as these tribes, rendered apprehensive by the building of operations, kept changing their encampments with incredible rapidity, like locusts, and so perhaps had a better general view of the progress of the wall than we, the builders. Nevertheless, the task of construction probably could not have been carried out any other way. To understand this, we must take into account the following. The wall was to be protection for centuries. Accordingly, the most scrupulous care in the building, the application of architectural wisdom of all known ages and peoples, an unremitting sense of personal responsibility in the builders were indispensable prerequisites for the work. True, for the more purely manual tasks, ignorant and day labourers from the populace, men, women and children who offered their services for good money, could be employed. But for the supervision even of 4-day labourers, an expert versed in the art of building were required, a man who were capable of entering into and feeling with all his art what were involved. The higher the task, the greater the responsibility. And such men were actually to be had, if not indeed so abundantly as the work of construction could have yet absorbed, yet in great numbers. For the work had not been undertaken without thought. 50 years before the first stone were laid, the art of architecture, and especially that of masonry, had been proclaimed as the most important branch of knowledge throughout the whole area of China that would be walled round, and all other arts gained recognition only in so far as they had reference to it. I can still remember quite well us standing as small children, scarcely sure on our feet, in our teacher's garden, and being ordered to build a sort of wall out of pebbles. And then the teacher, girding up his robe, ran full tilt against the wall, of course knocking it down, and scolded us so terribly for it that the shoddiness of our work, that we ran reaping in all directions to our parents. A trivial incident, but significant of the spirit of the time. I were lucky, inasmuch as the building of the wall was just beginning when at 20 I had passed the last examination of the lowest grade school. I say lucky, for many who before my time had achieved the higher degree of culture available to them could find nothing year after year to do with their knowledge, and drifted uselessly about with the most splendid architectural plans in their heads, and sank by thousands into hopelessness. But those who finally come to be employed in the work as supervisors, even though it might be of the lowest rank, were truly worthy of their task. They were masons who had reflected much, and did not cease to reflect on the building of the wall. Men who, with the first stone with which they sank in the ground, felt themselves a part of the wall. Masons of that kind, of course, had not only a desire to perform their work in the most thorough manner, but were also impatient to see the wall finished in its complete perfection. Day labourers have not this impatience, for they look only to their wages, and the higher supervisors, indeed, even the supervisors of middle rank, could see enough of the manifold growth of the construction to keep their spirits confident and art. But to encourage the subordinate supervisors, intellectually so vastly superior to their apparently petty task, other means must be taken. One could not, for instance, expect them to lay one stone on another for months or even years on end, in an uninhabited mountainous region hundreds of miles from their homes. The hopelessness of such an hard toil, which could not reach completion even in their longest lifetime, would have cast them into despair and above all made them less capable for the work. It was this reason that the system of piecemeal building was decided on. 500 yards could be accomplished in about 5 years. By that time, however, the supervisors were, as a rule, really quite exhausted, and had lost all faith in themselves, in the wall, in the world. Accordingly, while they were still exalted by the jubilant celebration marking the completion of the 1,000 yards of wall, they were sent far, far away, saw in their journey, finished sections of the wall rising here and there, came past the quarters of the High Command, and were presented with badges of honour, heard the rejoicing of new armies of labour screaming past from the depths of the land, saw forests being cut down and become supports for the wall, saw mountains being hewn into stones for the wall, heard at the holy shrines hymns rising in which the pious prayed for the completion of the wall. All this assuaged their impatience. The quiet life of their homes, where they rested sometimes, strengthened them. The humble credulity with which their reports were listened to, the confidence with which the simple and peaceful burgher believed the eventual completion of the wall, all this tightened up against the cords of the soul. Like eternally hopeful children, they then said farewell to their homes, the desire once more to labour on the wall of the nation become irresistible. They set off earlier than they needed. Half the village accompanied them for long distances. Groups of people with banners and scars waving on were all on the white roads, and never before had they seen how great and rich and beautiful and worthy a love their country was. Every fellow countryman were a brother for whom One would build in a wall of protection, and who would return lifelong thanks for it with all he had and did. Une, shoulder to shoulder, a ring of brothers, a current of blood no longer confined with a narrow circulation of one body, but sweetly rolling and yet e'er returning through the endless leagues of China. Thus, then, the system of piecemeal construction becomes comprehensible. But there were still other reasons for it as well. Nor is there anything odd in my pausing over this question for so long. It is one of the crucial problems in the old building of the wall, unimportant as it may appear at first glance. If I am to convey and make understandable the ideas and feelings of that time, I cannot go deeply enough into this very question. First, then, it must be said, in those days things were achieved scarcely inferior to the construction of the Tower of Babel, though as regards divine approval, at least according to the human reckoning, strongly at variance with that work. I say this because during the early days of building, the scholar wrote a book in which he drew the comparison in the most exhaustive way. In it he tried to prove that the Tower of Babel failed to reach its goal, not because of the reasons universally advanced, or at least that among those recognised reasons the most important of all was not to be found. His proofs were drawn not merely from written documents and reports. He also claimed to have made inquiries on the spot, and to have discovered that the tower failed and were bound to fail because of the weakness of the foundation. In this respect, at any rate, our age were vastly superior to the ancient one. Almost every educated man of our time were a mason by profession, and infallible in the matter of laying foundations. That, however, were not what our scholar was concerned to prove, for he maintained that the Great Wall alone would provide the first time in history, in all of mankind, a secure foundation for a new Tower of Babel. First the wall, therefore, and then the tower. His book were in everyone's hands at that time, but I admit that even today I cannot quite make out how he conceived this tower. How could the wall, which did not form even a circle, but only a sort of quarter or half circle, provide the foundations for a tower? That could obviously be meant only in a spiritual sense. But in that case, why build the actual wall, which after all was something concrete, the result of the lifelong labour of multitudes of people? And why were there in the book plans, somewhat nebulous plans it must be admitted, of the tower, and proposals worked out in detail for mobilising the people's energies for the stupendous new work? There were many wild ideas in people's heads at that time. This scholar's book is only one example. Perhaps simply because so many were trying to join forces as far as they could for the achievement of a single aim. Human nature, essentially changeable, unstable as the dust, can endure no restraint. If it binds itself, it soon begins to tear madly at its bonds, until it rends everything asunder, the wall, the bonds, and its very self. It is possible that these very considerations, which militated amongst the building of the wall, were not left out of account by the High Command when the system of piecemeal construction was decided on. We, and here I speak in the name of many people, did not really know then ourselves until we had carefully scrutinised the decrees of the High Command, when we discovered that without the High Command neither our book learning nor our human understanding would have sufficed for the humble task which we performed in the Great Hall. And the office of the command, where it was, and who sat there no one whom I have asked knew, then or knows now. In that office one may be certain that all human thoughts and desires were resolved, and counter them all human aims and fulfilments. And through the window the reflected splendours of divine worlds fell on the hands of the leaders as they traced their plans. And for that reason the incorruptible observer must hold that the command, if it had seriously desired it, could also overcome these difficulties which prevented a system of continuous construction. There remains, therefore, nothing but the conclusion that the command deliberately chose the system of piecemeal construction. But the piecemeal construction were only a makeshift, and therefore inexpedient. Remains the conclusion that the command willed something inexpedient. Strange conclusion, true, and yet in one respect it has much to be said for it. One can perhaps safely discuss it now. In those days many people, and among them the best, had a secret maxim which ran, "Try with all your might to comprehend the decrees of the High Command, but only up to a certain point, then avoid further meditation." A very wise maxim, which moreover were elaborated in a parable that were later often quoted. Avoid further meditation, but not because it might be harmful. It is not at all certain that it would be harmful. What is harmful or not harmful has nothing to do with the question. Consider rather a river in spring. It rises until it grows mightier, and nourishes more richly the soil of the long stretch of its banks, still maintaining its own course till it reaches the sea, where it is all the more welcome because it is a worthier ally. Thus far may you urge your meditations on the decrees of the High Command. But after that the river overflows its banks, loses outline and shape, slows down the speed of its current, tries to ignore its destiny by forming little seas in the interior of the land, damages the field, and yet cannot maintain itself for long in its new expanse, but must run back between its banks again, must even dry up wretchedly in the hot season that presently follows. Thus far you may not urge your meditations on the decree of the High Command. Now, though this parable may have had extraordinary point and force during the building of the wall, it is at most only a restricted relevance for my present essay. My inquiry is purely historical. No lightning flashes any longer from the long since vanished thunderclouds, and so I may venture to seek for an explanation of the system of piecemeal construction, which goes farther than the one that contented people then. The limits which my capacity for thought imposes upon me are narrow enough, but the province to be traversed here is infinite. Against whom was the Great Wall to serve as protection? Against the people of the north. Now, I come from the southeast of China. No northeast people can menace us there. We read of them in the books of the ancients. The cruelties which they commit in accordance with their nature make us sigh beneath our peaceful trees. The faithful representations of the artists show us their faces, the damned, their gaping mouths, their jaws furnished with great pointed teeth, their half-shut eyes that already seem to be seeking out the victim, whom their jaws will rend and devour. When our children are unruly, we show them these pictures, and at once they fly weeping into our arms. But nothing more than that do we know about these northerners. We have not seen them, and if we remain in our villages, shall never see them, even if on their wild horses they should ride as hard as they can straight towards us. The land is too vast and would not let them reach us. They would end their course in the empty air. Why then, since this is so, did we leave our homes, the streams with its bridges, our mothers and fathers, our weeping wives, our children who needed care, and depart for the distant city to be trained there, while our thoughts journey still farther away, to the wall to the north? Why? A question for the High Command. Our leaders know us. They absorbed us in gigantic anxieties, know of us, know our petty pursuits, see us sitting together in our humble huts, and approve or disapprove the evening prayer which the father of the house recites in the midst of his family. And if I may be allowed to express such ideas about the High Command, then I must say that in my opinion the High Command has existed from old times and were not assembled, say like a gathering of mandarins summoned hastily to discuss somebody's fine dream in a conference, as hastily terminated, so that very evening the people are drummed out of their beds to carry out what has been decided, even if it should be nothing but an illumination in honour of a god who may have shown great favour to their masters the day before, only to drive them in some dark corner with cudgel blows tomorrow, almost before the illuminations had died down. For rather do I believe that the High Command has existed from all eternity, and the decision to build the wall likewise. Unwitting peoples of the north who imagined they were the cause of it. Honest unwitting emperor who imagined he decreed it. We builders of the wall know that it were not so, and hold our tongues. During the building of the wall, and ever since to this very day, I have occupied myself almost exclusively with the comparative history of races. There are certain questions which one can probe to the marrow, as it were, only by this method, and I have discovered that we Chinese possess certain folk and political institutions that are unique in their clarity, others again are unique in their obscurity. The desire to trace the cause of these phenomena, especially the latter, has always teased me, and teases me still, and the building of the wall is itself essentially involved with these problems. Now, one of the most obscure of our institutions is that of the empire itself. In Pekin, naturally, at the imperial court, there is some clarity to be found on this subject, though even that is more elusive than real. Also, the teachers of political law and history in the high schools claim to be exactly informed on these matters, and to be capable of passing on their knowledge to their students. The farther one descends among the lower schools, the more, naturally enough, does one find teachers and pupils' doubts of their own knowledge vanishing, and a superficial culture mounting sky-high rounds a few precepts that have been drilled into people's minds for centuries. Precepts which, though they have lost nothing of their eternal truth, remain eternally invisible in this fog of confusion. But it's precisely this question of the empire which, in my opinion, the common people should be asked to answer, since after all they are the empire's final support. Here I must confess I can only speak once more of my native place. Except for the nature gods and their ritual, which fills the whole year in such beautiful and rich alternation, we think only about the emperor, but not about the present one, or rather we would think about the present one if we knew who he was or knew anything definite about him. True, and it's the sole curiosity that fills us. We are always trying to get information on this subject, but, strange as it may sound, it is almost impossible to discover anything, either from pilgrims, though they have wandered through the many lands, or from near or distant villages, or from sailors, though they have navigated not only our little stream, but also the sacred rivers. One hears a great many things, true, they can gather nothing definite. So vast is our land that no fable could do justice to its vastness. The heavens can scarcely span it, and Pekin is only a dot in it, and the imperial palace less than a dot. The emperor, as such, is on the other hand, is mighty throughout all of the hierarchies of the world, admitted. But the extant emperor, a man like us, lies much like us on a couch which is of generous proportions, perhaps, and yet very possibly may be quite narrow and short. Like us, he sometimes stretches himself, and when he is very tired, yawns with his delicately cut mouth. But how should we know anything about that? Thousands of miles away in the south, almost on the borders of the Tibetan Islands. And besides, any Titan, even if they did reach us, would arrive far too late, would have become obsolete long before they reached us. The Emperor is always surrounded by a brilliant and yet ambiguous throng of nobles and courtiers, malice and enmity in the guise of servants and friends, who form a counterweight to the imperial power and perpetually labour to unseat the ruler from his place with poisoned arrows. The empire is immortal, but the Emperor himself totters and falls from his throne. Yes, whole dynasties sink in the end, and breathe their last in the death rattle. Of those struggles and sufferings the people will never know. Like tardy arrivals, like strangers in a city, they stand at the end of some densely thronged side street, peacefully munching the food they have brought with them, while far away in front, in the market square at the heart of the city, the execution of their ruler is proceeding. There is a parable which describes this situation very well. The Emperor, so it runs, has sent a message to you, the humble subject, the insignificant shadow cowering in the remotest distance before the imperial sun. The Emperor, from his deathbed, has sent you a message to you alone. He has commanded the messenger to kneel down by the bed and has whispered the message to him. So much store did he lay on it that he ordered the messenger to whisper it back in his ear again. Then, with another head, he has confirmed that he is right. Yet before the assembled spectators of his death, all the obstructing walls have been broken down, and on the spacious and lofty mountain open staircase stand in a ring the great princes of the empire. Before all these he has delivered his message. The messenger immediately sets out on his journey, a powerful and as indefatigable man, now pushing with his right arm, now with his left. He cleaves a way for himself through the throng. If he encounters resistance, he points to his breast with a symbol of the sun. Oop. Hey Nazca, yeah, doing pretty good. We're reading an account of the construction of the Great Wall of China, which I thought was a story, but I'm not quite sure. It seemed like more of a musing on the topic. So I don't really think I can offer you a summary. But we're almost done with it now, so if you want to stick around, we'll be moving over to a ghost story shortly after this. Cool. If he encounters resistance, he points to his breast, where the symbol of the sun glitters. The way too is made easier for him than it would be for any other man. But the multitudes are so vast, their numbers have no end. If he could reach the open fields, how fast he would fly, and soon doubtless you would hear the welcoming hammering of his fist on your door. Instead, how vainly does he wear out his strength. Still, he is only making his way through the chambers of the innermost palace. Ne'er will he get to the end of them, and if he succeeds in that, nothing would be gained. He must fight his way next down the stairs, and if he succeeds in that, nothing would be gained. The courts would still have to be crossed, and after the courts, the second outer palace, and once more stairs and courts, and once more another palace, and so on for thousands of years. And if at last he should burst through the outermost gate, but never can that happen. The imperial capital would lie before him, the centre of the world, crowned and bursting with its own refuse. Nobody could fight his way through here, even with a message from a dead man. You sit at your window when the evening falls and dream it to yourself. Just so, as hopelessly and hopefully, do our people regard the Emperor. They do not know what emperor is reigning, and there exist doubts regarding even the name of the dynasty. In school, a great deal is taught about the dynasties with the dates of succession, but the universal uncertainty on this matter is so great that even the best scholars are always drawn into it. Long dead emperors are set on the throne in our villages, and one that only lives in song recently had a proclamation of his read out by the priest before the altar. Battles that are old history are new to us, and one's neighbour rushes in with jubilant face to tell the news. The wiles of the emperors, pampered and overweening, seduced from noble custom by wily courtiers, swelling with ambition, vehement in their greed, uncontrollable in their lust, practise their abominations ere and near. The more deeply they are buried in time, the more glaring are the colours in which their deeds are painted. With a loud cry of woe, our village eventually hears how an empress drank her husband's blood in long draughts thousands of years ago. Thus then do our people deal with departed emperors, but the living ruler they confuse among the dead. If once, only once in a man's lifetime, an imperial official on his tour of the provinces should arrive by chance at our village, make certain announcements in the name of the government, scrutinise the tax lists, examine the school children, inquire on the priest regarding our doings and affairs, and then, before he steps into his litter, should sum up his impression in verbose admonitions to the assembled commune, then a smile flits over every face. Each man throws a stolen glance at his neighbour, and bends over his children so as not to be observed by the official. Why, they think to themselves, he's speaking of a dead man as if he were alive. This emperor of his died long ago. The dynasty is blotted out. The good official is having his joke with us, but we will behave as if we did not notice it, so as not to offend him. But we shall obey in earnest no one but our present ruler, for to do so would be a crime. And behind the departing litter of the official there arises in might as rulers of the village some figure fortuitously existed from an urn already crumbled to dust. Similarly, our people are but little affected by revolutions in the state or contemporary wars. I recall an incident in my youth. A revolt had broken out in a neighbouring but yet quite distant province. What caused it I can no longer remember, nor is it of any importance now. Occasions for revolt can be found there any day. The people are an excitable people. Well, one day a leaflet published by the rebels was brought to my father's house by a beggar who had crossed that province. It happened to be a feast day. Our rooms were filled with guests. The priest sat in the chief place and studied the sheet. Suddenly everybody started to laugh. In the confusion the sheet were torn. The beggar, who however had already received abundant alms, was driven out of the room with blows. The guests dispersed to enjoy the beautiful day. Why? The dialect of this neighbouring province differs in some essential respects from ours, and this difference occurs also in certain turns of the written speech, for which us have an archaic character. Hardly had the priest read out 2 lines before he had already come to our decision. Ancient history told long ago, old sorrows long since healed. And though, so it seems to me in recollection, the gruesomeness of the living present was irrefutably conveyed by the beggar's words, we laughed and shook our heads and refused to listen any longer. So eager are our people to obliterate the present. If from such appearances anyone should draw the conclusion that in reality we have no emperor, he would not be far from the truth. Over and over again it must be repeated, there is perhaps no people more faithful with the emperor than ours in the south, but the emperor derives no advantage from our fidelity. True, the sacred dragon stands on the little column at the end of our village, and ever since the beginning of human memory it has breathed out its fiery breath in the direction of Pekin in token of homage. But Pekin itself is stranger to the people in our village than the next world. Can there really be a village where the houses stand side by side, covering all the fields for a greater distance than one can see from our hills? And can there be dense crowds of people packed between these houses day and night? We find it more difficult to picture such a city than to believe that Pekin and its emperor are one, a cloud, say, peacefully voyaging beneath the sun in the course of the ages. Now, the result of holding such opinions in life is a life on the old free and unconstrained. By no means immoral, however. Hardly ever have I found in my travels such pure morals as in my native village. Be a life that is subject to no contemporary law, and attends only the exhortations and warnings which come to us from olden times. I guard it against large generalizations, and do not assert that in all the countless villages in my province it is so, far less in all the 500 provinces of China. Yet perhaps I may venture to assert, on the basis of the many writings of this subject that I have read, as well as from my own observation, the building of the wall in particular, with its abundance of human material, provided a man of sensibility with the opportunity of traversing the souls of almost all the provinces. On the basis of all this, then, perhaps I may venture to assert that the prevailing attitude to the emperor shows persistently and universally something fundamentally in common with that of our village. Now, I have no wish whatever to represent this attitude as a virtue. On the contrary, true, the essential responsibility for it lies with the government, which in the ancient empire in the world has not yet succeeded in developing, or has neglected to develop, the institution of the emperor to such precision that its workings extend directly and unceasingly to the farthest frontiers of the land. On the other hand, however, there is also involved a certain feebleness of faith and imaginative power on the part of the people, that prevents them from raising the empire out of its stagnation in Pekin and clasping all in its palpable living reality to their own breasts, which yet desire nothing better than but once to feel that touch and then to die. This attitude, then, is certainly no virtue. All the more remarkable is that this very weakness should seem to be one of the greatest unifying influences among our people. Indeed, if one may dare to use the expression, the very ground on which we live. To set about establishing a fundamental defect here would mean undermining not only our consciousness, but what is far worse, our feet. And for that reason I shall not proceed any further at this stage with my inquiry into these questions. And that's the end of the Great Wall of China. That's an odd one. That's a very odd one indeed. Let me have a quick drink of water while I think about it. Right. There are essentially 3 parts to this, I think, at least as I've perceived it. The first is this discussion of the way that the Wall of China itself will be built piecemeal. And that's sort of the unifying factor that runs through all of this, the actual description of the way it was constructed. Meeting at its northernmost corner, and then before that constructed in 1,000-yard sections, 2 at a time together, piecemeal, and only eventually linked together at the end. Some of it even after the war was considered finished by most people. That's an interesting historical fact. And then the first explanation as to why this was done, that these people educated and raised to build this wall, raised for 50 years to do so, would be discouraged by any further work in construction in obscure provinces and out of the place, and so by constructing it in only such segments they could then be rotated out and given a chance to return to their homes and see all the excitement and unity behind it. And then finally this exploration of the idea that the emperor, or at least the living emperor, has no real power, and that only the idea of the emperor is what is, well, revered and held sacred. And it's interesting. I mean, it's a true fact that, across an empire of significant enough size, which China is, historically a very large empire, orders coming from the central provinces where the capital is can keep months or even years to get to the edge provinces. And so by extending that into a sort of mythical sense, it's reasonable enough to come to the conclusion that an empire of significant enough size might have people and authorities who never hear from a living emperor, or as it's described, they only hear it once in their lives. It's interesting, really. You've got the proverbs here and that. It's a unifying sort of cultural tale. A sort of mythologized history of China as a sort of culture, told from a first-person perspective, which is strange, because I do not believe that Franz Kafka is a Chinese name. Again, I wonder if this is an account told to him by someone that he is transcribing, or if it's just a fictionalised account, or history, or mythology. I really don't know. I don't feel comfortable calling it a story, really, because it's not a narrative running through it. It's a piece of writing, but yeah, I don't know. An interesting piece at any rate. Still, no point to be dwelling on it. Let's instead... I don't think I've got anything else to say about it, so we'll move on to our next story. On the M.R. James Ghost Tales, number 13. Now, I think this one is about the same way in sort of page count as the one we just read, but I do believe that the type in these books is a little bit larger. So it'll probably be slightly shorter, so I reckon we'll come out to about around an hour. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less. Yeah. I'm assuming everyone is just lurking, so I'm not going to await any questions. I'm just going to get right onto it. So, without any further ado, number 13. Among the towns of Jutland, Varburg, just the old high place. It is the seat of a bishopric. It is an handsome but almost entirely new cathedral, a charming garden, a lake of great beauty, and many stalks. Near it is old, accounted one of the prettiest things in Denmark, and hard by is Finderup, where masked Stig murdered King Eric Glipping on St. Cecilia's Day in the year 1286. 56 blows of a square-headed iron mace were traced on Eric's skull when his tomb were opened in the 17th century, but I'm not writing a guard book. There are good hotels in Viborg. Preslers and the Phoenix are all that can be desired, but my cousin, whose experiences I have to tell you now, went to the Golden Lion the first time that he visited Varborg. He has not been there since, and the following pages will perhaps explain the reason of his abstention. The Golden Lion is one of the very few houses of the town that were not destroyed in the Great Fire of 1726, which practically demolished the cathedral, the Sognekirke, the Radhus, and so much else that were old and interesting. It is a great red brick house, that is, the front door is of brick, with Corby steps on the gables and a text over the door. The courtyard in which the omnibus drives its back The courtyard in which the omnibus drives is of black and white cagework in wooden plaster. The sun was declining in the heavens when my cousin walked up to the door, and the light smote full upon the imposing facade of the house. He was delighted with the old-fashioned aspect of the place, and promised herself a thoroughly satisfactory and amusing stay in an inn so typical of old Jutland. It were not business in the ordinary sense of the word that had brought Mr. Anderson to Warburg. He were engaged upon some researches into the church history of Denmark, and it had come to his knowledge that in the Rigsarkiv of Warburg there were papers saved from the fire, relating to the last days of Roman Catholicism in the country. He proposed, therefore, to spend a considerable time, perhaps as much as a fortnight or 3 weeks, in examining and copying these, and he hoped that the Golden Lion would be able to give him a room of sufficient size to serve alike as a bedroom and study. His wishes were explained to the landlord, and, after a certain amount of thought, the latter suggested that perhaps it might be the best way for the gentleman to look at one of 2 of the larger rooms and pick one for himself. It seemed a good idea. The top floor was soon rejected, as entailing too much getting upstairs after the day's work. The second floor contained no room of exactly the dimensions required. On the first floor there were a choice of 2 or 3 rooms which would, as far as size went, suit admirably. The landlord was strongly in favour of number 17, but Mr. Anderson pointed out that its windows commanded only the blank wall of the next house, and it would be very dark in the afternoon. Either number 12 or number 14 would be better, but both of them looked on the street, and the bright evening light of the pretty view would more than compensate him from the additional amount of noise. Eventually number 12 was selected. Like its neighbours, it had 3 windows, all on the one side of the room. It were fairly high and unusually long. There were, of course, no fireplace, but the stove were handsome and rather old, a cast iron erection on the side of which were a representation of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, and the inscription 1 Bogmus Cap 22 above. Nothing else in the room were remarkable. The only interesting picture were an old colour print of the town, dated about 1820. Supper time were approaching, but when Anderson, refreshed by the ordinary ablutions, descended the staircase, there was still a few minutes before the bell rang. He devoted them to examining the list of his fellow lodgers. As is usual in Denmark, their names were displayed on a large blackboard, divided into columns and lines, the numbers of the rooms being painted in at the beginning of each line. The lists were not exciting. They were an advocate, or Sagfodder, a German, and some bagmen from Copenhagen. The one and only point which suggested any food for thought was the absence of any number 13 from the table of the rooms, and even this was a thing which Anderson had already noticed half a dozen times in his experience at Danish hotels. He could not help wondering whether the objection to that particular number, common as it is, was so widespread and so strong as to make it difficult to let the room so ticketed, and he resolved to ask the landlord if he and his colleagues in the profession had actually met with many clients who refused to be accommodated in the 13th room. He had nothing to tell me. I am giving the story as I heard it from him, about what passed at supper, and the evening, which was spent in unpacking and arranging his clothes, books and papers, were not more eventful. Towards 11 o'clock he resolved to go to bed, but with him, as with a good many other people nowadays, an almost necessary preliminary to bed, if he meant to sleep, were the reading of a few pages of print, and he now remembered that the particular book which he had been reading in the train, which alone would satisfy him at that present moment, were in the pocket of his greatcoat, then hanging on a peg outside the dining room. To run down and secure it were the work of a moment, and, as the passages were by no means dark, it were not difficult for him to find his way back to his own door. So at least he thought. When he arrived there and turned the handle, the door entirely refused to open, and he caught the sound of heavy movement toward it from within. He had tried the wrong door, of course. Was his own room the right or the left? He glanced at the number. It were 13. His room would be on the left, and so it were. And not before he had been in bed for some minutes, had read his one of 3 or 4 pages of his book, blown out his light, and turned over to go to sleep, did it occur to him that, whereas on the blackboard of the hotel there had been no number 13, there were undoubtedly a room numbered 13 in the hotel. He felt rather sorry he had not chosen it for his own. Perhaps he might have done the landlord a little service by occupying it, and given him the chance to satisfy him, or saying that a well-born English gentleman had lived in it for 3 weeks and liked it very much. But probably it were used as a servant's room or something of the kind. After all, it will most likely not so large or so good as a room as his own. And he looked drowsily about the room, which were fairly perceptible in the half light from the street lamp. It were a curious effect, he thought. Rooms usually look larger in a dim light than the full one, but this seemed to have contracted in length and grown proportionately higher. Well, well. Sleep was more important than these vague ruminations, and asleep he went. On the day after his arrival, Anderson attacked the Rigsarkiv of Warburg. He was, as one might expect in Denmark, kindly received, and access to all that he wished to see were made as easy for him as possible. The documents laid before him were far more numerous and interesting than he had anticipated. Beside official papers, there are a large bundle of correspondence relating to Bishop Jürgen Flies, the last Roman Catholic who held the see, and in these there cropped up many amusing and what are called intimate details of private life and individual character. There was much talk of an house owned by the bishop, but not inhabited by him, in the town. Its tenant were apparently somewhat of a scandal and a stumbling block to the reforming party. He was a disgrace, they wrote, to the city. He practised secret and wicked arts, and had sold his soul to the enemy. It were of a piece with the gross corruption and superstition of the Babylonish church, and the Babylonish church, that such a viper and blood-sucking trollman should be patronised and harboured by the bishop. The bishop met these reproaches boldly. He protested his own abhorrence of all such things as secret arts, and required his antagonist to bring the matter before the proper court, of course the spiritual court, and to sift it to the bottom. No one could be more ready and willing than himself to condemn Nicholas Franken, as if the evidence showed him to have been guilty of any crimes he'd formerly alleged against him. Anderson had not time to do more than glance at the next layer of the Protestant leader, Rasmus Nielsen, before the record office would close for the day, but he gathered its general tenor, which was to the effect that Christian men were now no longer bound by the decision of bishops of Rome, and that the bishops' court were not and could not be a fit or competent tribunal to judge so grave and weighty a cause. On leaving the office, Mr. Anderson were accompanied by the old gentleman who presided over it, and as they walked, the conversation very naturally turned to the paper of which I have just been speaking. Escavernius, the archivist of Warburg, though very well informed as to the general run of documents under his charge, were not a specialist in those of the Reformation period. He was much interested in what Anderson had to tell him about them. He looked forward with great pleasure, he said, to seeing the publication in which Mr. Anderson spoke of embody in their contents. This house of the Bishop of Flies, he added, is a great puzzle to me where it can have stood. I have studied carefully the topography of Warburg, but it is most unlucky. Of the old terrier of the bishop's property, which was made in 1560, and of which we have the great part in the archive, just a piece which had the list of the town property is missing. Never mind, perhaps I should some day succeed to find him. After taking some exercise, I forget exactly how or where, Anderson went back to the Golden Lion, his supper, his game of patience, and his bed. On the way to his room, it occurred to him that he had forgotten to talk to the landlord about the omission of number 13 from the hotel, and also that he might as well make sure that number 13 did actually exist before he made any reference to the matter. The decision was not difficult to arrive at. There was the door with its number as plain as could be, and work of some kind reverently going on inside it, for as he neared the door he could hear footsteps and voices, or a voice, within. During the few seconds in which he halted to make sure of the number, the footsteps ceased, seemingly very near the door, and he was a little startled as hearing a quick hissing breathing of a person in strong excitement. He went on to his own room, and again he was surprised to find how much smaller it seemed now than when he had selected it. It was a slight disappointment, but only slight. He found it really not large enough. He could very easily shift to another. In the meantime he wanted something. As far as I remember, it were a pocket handkerchief out of his portmanteau, which had been placed by the porter on a very inadequate trestle or stool against the wall at the farthest end of the room from his bed. It were a very curious thing. The portmanteau were not to be seen. It had been moved by officious servants. Doubtless the contents had been put in the wardrobe. No, none of them were there. This was vexatious. The idea of theft he dismissed at once. Such things rarely happen in Denmark, but some piece of stupidity had certainly been performed, which is not so uncommon, and the stupige must be severely spoken to. Whatever it was that he wanted, it was not so necessary to his comfort that he could not wait till the morning for it, and he therefore settled not to ring the bell and disturb the servants. He went to the window, the right-hand window it was, and looking out on the quiet street. There were a tall building opposite, with large spaces of dead wall, no passer-by, a dark night, and very little to be seen of any kind. The light was behind him, and he could see his own shadow clearly cast on the wall opposite. Also the shadow of the bearded man in number 11 on the left, who passed to and fro in shirt-sleeve once or twice, and was seen first brushing his hair, and later on in a nightgown. Also the shadow of the occupant of number 13 on the right. This might be more interesting. Number 13 were, like himself, leaning on his elbows at the windowsill, looking out on the street. He seemed to be a tall, thin man, or was it by any chance a woman? At least it was someone who covered his or her head with some kind of drapery before going to bed, and he thought must be possessed of a red lampshade. The lamp must be flickering very much. There were a distinct playing up and down of dull red light on the opposite wall. He craned out a little to see if he could make any more of the figure, but beyond the fold of some light, perhaps white material, of the windowsill, he could see nothing. Now came a distant step in the street, and its approach seemed to recall number 13 to a sense of his exposed position. Very swiftly and suddenly he swept aside from the window, and his red light went out. Anderson, who had been smoking a cigarette, laid the end of it on the windowsill and went to bed. Next morning he was awoken by the stewpage with hot water, etc. He roused himself, and after thinking out the correct Danish words, said as distinctly as he could, "You must not move my portmanteau. Where is it?" As is not uncommon, the maid laughed and went away without making any distinct answer. Anderson, rather irritated, sat up in bed, intending to call her back, but he remained sitting up, staring straight in front of him. There was his portmanteau on his trestle, exactly where he had seen the porter put it when he first arrived. This was a rude shock for a man who prided himself on his accuracy of observation. How it could possibly have escaped him the night before, he did not pretend to understand. At any rate, there it were now. The daylight showed more than the portmanteau. He let the true proportions of the room, which its 3 windows, appear, and satisfied its tenant that his choice after all had not been a bad one. When he was almost dressed, he walked to the middle of one of the 3 windows to look out at the weather. Another shock awaited him. Strangely unobservant he must have been last night. He could have sworn 10 times over that he had been smoking at the right-hand window, the last thing before he went to bed, and here was his cigarette end on the still of the middle window. He started to go down to breakfast, rather late, but number 13 were later. Here were his boots still outside of his door, a gentleman's boots. So number 13 were a man, not a woman. Just then he caught sight of the number on the door. It was 14. He thought he must have passed number 13 without noticing it. 3 stupid mistakes in 12 hours were too much for a methodical, accurate-minded man, so he turned back to make sure. The next to number 14 was the number 12, his own room. There were no number 13 at all. After some minutes devoted to a careful consideration of everything he had to eat and drink during the last 24 hours, Anderson decided to give the question up. If his sight or his brain were given way, he would have plenty of opportunities for ascertaining that fact. If not, then he were evidently being treated to a very interesting experience. In either case, the development of events would certainly be worth watching. During the day, he continued his examination of the episcopal correspondences, which I have already summarised. To his disappointment, they were incomplete. Only one other letter could be found which referred to the affair of Mag Nicholas Franken. It was from the Bishop Jorgen Friis to Ramon Nielsen. He said, "Although we are not in the least degree inclined to assent to your judgment concerning our court, and shall be prepared if need be to withstand you to the utmost in that behalf, yet forasmuch as our trusty and well-beloved Mag Nicholas Franken, against whom you have dared to allege certain false and malicious charges, have been suddenly removed from among us, it is appeasement that the question for the time falls. But forasmuch as you further allege the Apostle and Evangelist St. John in his heavenly Apocalypse describes the Holy Roman Church under the guise and symbol of the Scarlet Woman, be it known to you, etc." Such search as he might, Anderson could find no sequel to this letter, nor any clue to the cause or manner of the removal of the casus belli. He could only suppose that Franken had died suddenly, and as there were only 2 days between the date of Nielsen's last letter, when Franken were evidently still in being, and this is the bishop's letter, the death must have been completely unexpected. In the afternoon he paid a short visit to Oud, and took his tea at Bekeland. Nor could he notice, although he were in a somewhat nervous frame of mind, that there were any indication of such a failure of eye or brain as his experiences of the morning had led him to fear. At supper he found himself next to the landlord. "What," he asked him, after some indifferent conversation, "is the reason why in most of the hotels one visits in this country, number 13 is left out of the list of rooms? I see you have none here." The landlord seemed amused. "To think you should have noticed a thing like that. I've thought about it once or twice myself, to tell the truth. An educated man, I've said, has no business with these superstitious notions. I was brought up myself here in the high school of Viborg, and our old master was always a man to set his face against anything of that kind. He's been dead now this many years. A fine upstanding man he was, and ready with his hand as well as his head. I recollect us boys one snowy day." Here he plunged into reminiscence. "You don't think there's any particular objection to having number 13, said Anderson. "Ah, to be sure. Well, you understand I was brought up to the business by my poor old father. He kept a hotel in Arnhouse first, and then, when you were born, he moved to Viborg here, with his native place, and had the Phoenix here until he died. That was in 1876. Then I started business in Silkeborg, and only the year before last, I moved into this house. There followed more details as to the state of the house and business when first taken over. When you came, was there a number 13? No, I was going to tell you about that. You see, in a place like this, the commercial class, the travellers, are what we have to provide for, in general. But them in number 13, they'd as soon sleep in the street or sooner. As far as I'm concerned myself, it wouldn't have made a penny difference to me the number of my room was, and so I've often said to them, but they stick to it that it brings them bad luck. Quantities of stories they have among them of men that have slept in number 13 and never been the same again, or less their best customers, or one thing or another, said the landlord, often searching for a more graphic phrase. And what do you use your number 13 for? Said Anderson, conscious as he said the words, a curious anxiety, quite disproportionately important to the question. My number 13? Why, I don't tell you that there is no such thing in the house. I thought you might have noticed that. If there was, it would be next door to your own room. Well, yes, only I happened to think, as I fancied last night, I'd seen a door number 13 in that passage. And really, I'm almost certain I must have been right, for I saw it line up before as well. Of course, Herr Christensen laughed at this notion with scorn, and Anderson had expected, and emphasised with much iteration the fact that no number 13 existed or had existed before him in the hotel. Anderson were in some ways relieved by it, certainly, but still puzzled, and he began to think that the best way to make sure whether he had indeed been subjected to an illusion or not was to invite the landlord to his room to smoke a cigar later on in the evening. Some photographs of English towns which he had with him formed a sufficiently good excuse. Herr Christensen was flattered by the invitation and most willingly accepted it. About 10 o'clock he was to make his appearance, but before that Anderson had some letters to write, and retired for the purpose of writing them. He almost blushed to himself at confessing it, but he could not deny that it was the fact that he was becoming quite nervous about the question of the existence of number 13, so much so that he approached his room by way of number 11, in order that he might not be obliged to pass the door or the place where the door ought to be. He looked quickly and suspiciously about the room when he entered, but there was nothing beyond the indefinable air of being smaller than usual to warrant any misgivings. There were no question of the presence or absence of his portmanteau tonight. He had himself emptied it of its contents and lodged it under his bed. With a certain effort he dismissed the thought of number 13 from his mind and sat down to his writing. His neighbours were quiet enough. Occasionally a door opened in the passage and a pair of boots were thrown out, or a bagman walked past humming to himself, and outside from time to time a cart thundered over the atrocious cobblestones, or a quick step hurried along the flags. Anderson finished his letter, ordered in a whisky and soda, and then went to the window and studied the dead wall opposite, and the shadow upon it. As far as he could remember, number 14 had been occupied by the lawyer, a staid man who said little at meals, being generally engaged in studying a small bundle of papers beside his plate. Apparently, however, he was in the habit of giving vent to his animal spirits when alone. Why else should he be dancing? The shadow from the next room evidently showed that he were. Again and again his thin form crossed the window, his arms waved, and a gaunt leg was kicked up with surprising agility. He seemed to be barefooted, and the floor must be well laid, for no sound betrayed his movements. Sag-footed Hilda Jenkins, dancing at 10 o'clock at night in an hotel bedroom, seemed a fitting subject for an historical painting in the grand style, and Anderson's thoughts, like those of Emily in the Mysteries of Udolphus, began to arrange themselves in the following lines. When I return to my hotel at 10 o'clock p.m., the waiter thinks I am unwell. I do not care for them. When I lock my chamber door and put my boots outside, I dance all night upon the floor, and even if my neighbour swore, I'd go on dancing all the more, for I am acquainted with the law, and in despite of all their jaw, their protests are derived. Had not the landlord at this moment knocked at the door, it is probable that quite a long poem might have been laid before the reader. The judge, from his look of surprise when he found himself in the room, Herr Christensen was struck, as Anderson had been, by something unusual in its aspect. But he made no remark. Anderson's photographs interested him mightily, and formed the text of many autobiographical discourses, nor is it quite clear how the conversation could have been divided into the desired channel of number 13, and that the lawyer at this moment began to sing, and to sing in a manner which could leave no doubt in anyone's mind that he were either excitingly drunk or raving mad. It ran a thin voice that they heard, and it seemed dry, as if from long disuse. A word or two, and there were no question. It went sailing up to a surprising height, and were carried down with a despairing moan as of a winter wind in an hollow chimney, or an organ whose winds fail suddenly. It was a really horrible sound, and Anderson felt that if he had been alone, he must have fled for refuge and society to some neighbour bagman's room. The landlord sat open-mouthed. I don't understand it, he said at last, wiping his forehead. It is dreadful. I have heard it once before, but I made sure it was a cat. Is he mad? Said Anderson. He must be, and what a sad thing. Such a good customer, too, and so successful in his business, by what I hear, and a young family to bring up. Just then came an impatient knock at the door, and the knocker entered without waiting to be asked. It was the lawyer in dishabille, and with a very rough air, and a very angry he looked. I beg pardon, sir, he said, but I should be much obliged if you would kindly desist. Here he stopped, for it was evident that neither of the persons before him were responsible for the disturbance, and after a moment's lull it swelled forth again more wildly than before. "What in the name of heaven does it mean?" broke out the lawyer. "Where is it? Who is it? Am I going out of my mind?" "Surely, Herr Jensen, it comes from your room next door. Isn't there a cat or something stuck in the chimney?" This was the best that occurred to Anderson to say, and he realised its futility as he spoke, but anything were better than to stand and listen to that horrible voice, and look at the broad bright face of the landlord, all perspiring and quivering as he clutched the arms of his chair. "Impossible," the lawyer said. "Impossible. There is no chimney. I came here because I was convinced the cause was going on here. It was certainly the next room to mine." "Was there no door between yours and mine?" asked Anderson eagerly. "No, sir," said Herr Jensen rather sharply, "at least not this morning." "Ah," said Anderson. "Nor tonight?" "I am not sure," said the lawyer with some hesitation. Suddenly the crying or singing voice in the next room died away, and the singer heard seemingly to laugh to himself in a crooning manner. The three men actually shivered at the sound. Then there was silence. "Come," said the lawyer. "What have you to say, Herr Christensen? What does this mean?" "Good heaven," said Christensen. "How should I tell? I know no more than you, gentlemen. I pray I may never hear such a noise again." "So do I," said Herr Jensen, and added something under his breath. Anderson thought it sounded like the last words of the Psalter, "Omnis spiritus lodus Dominum," but he could not be sure. "But we must do something," said Anderson, "the three of us. Shall we go and investigate the next room?" "But that is Herr Jensen's room," wailed the landlord. "It is no use. He has come from there himself." "I am not so sure," said Jensen. "I think this gentleman is right. We must go and see." The only weapons of defence that could be mustered on the spot were a stick and an umbrella. The expedition went out in the passage, not without quakings. They were deadly quiet outside, but a light shone from under the next door. Anderson and Jensen approached it. The latter turned the handle and gave a sudden vigorous push. No use, the door stood fast. "Herr Christensen," said Jensen, "will you go and fetch the strongest servant you have in the place? We must see this through." The landlord nodded and hurried off, glad to be away from the scene of the action. Jensen and Anderson remained outside, looking at the door. "Here's number 13, you see," said the latter. "Yes, there is your door and there is mine," said Jensen. "My room has 3 windows in the daytime," said Anderson, with difficulty suppressing a nervous laugh. "By George, and so have mine," said the lawyer, turning and looking at Anderson. His back went out of the door. In that moment the door opened, and an arm came out and clawed at his shoulder. It was clad in ragged yellowish linen, and the bare skin, where it could be seen, had long grey hair upon it. Anderson was just in time to pull Jensen out of his reach with a cry of disgust and fright, when the door shut again, and a low laugh was heard. Jensen had seen nothing, but when Anderson hurriedly told him what a risk he had run, he fell into a great state of agitation, and suggested they should retire from the enterprise and lock themselves up in one or other of their rooms. However, while he was developing this plan, the landlord and 2 able-bodied men arrived on the scene, all looking rather serious and alarmed. Jensen met them with a torrent of description and explanation, which did not at all tend to encourage them from the fray. The men dropped the crowbars they had brought, and said flatly they were not going to risk their throats in the devil's den. The landlord was miserably nervous and undecided, conscious that if the danger were not faced, his hotel were ruined, and very loath to face it himself. Luckily, Anderson hit upon a way of rallying the demoralised force. "Is this," he said, "the Danish courage I have heard so much of? It isn't a German in there, and if it was, we are 5 to 1. The 2 servants and Jensen were stung into action by this, and made a dash at the door. "Stop," said Anderson, "don't lose your heads. You stay out here with a light, landlord, and one of you 2 men break the door and don't go in when it gives way." The men nodded, and the youngest stepped forward, raised his crowbar, and dealt a tremendous blow on the upper panel. The result was not in the least what any of them anticipated. There were no cracking or rending of wood, only a dull sound, as if the solid wall had been struck. The man dropped his tool with a shout and began rubbing his elbow. His cry drew their eye upon him for a moment. Then Anderson looked at the door again. It was gone. The plaster wall of the passage stared him in the face, with a considerable gash in it where the crowbar had struck it. Number 13 had passed out of existence. For a brief space they stood perfectly still, gazing at the blank wall. An early cock in the yard beneath heard the crow, and as Anderson glanced in the direction of the sound, he saw through the window at the end of the long passageway that the eastern sky was pale into the dawn. "Perhaps," said the landlord with hesitation, "you gentlemen would like another room for tonight, a double-bedded one." Neither Jensen nor Anderson reversed to the suggestion. They felt inclined to want in couple after their late experience. It was found convenient when each of them went to his room to collect the articles he wanted for the night, that the other should go with him and hold the candle. They noticed that both number 12 and number 14 had 3 windows. Next morning, the same party reassembled in number 12. The landlord was materially anxious to avoid engaging outside help, and it was imperative that the mystery attached to that part of the house should be cleared up. Accordingly, the 2 servants had been inducted to take upon the function of carpenters. The furniture were cleared away, and at the cost of a good many irretrievably damaged planks, the portion of the floor was taken up which lay nearest to number 14. You will naturally suppose that a skeleton, say that of Mag Nicholas Franken, were discovered. Yet it was not so. What they did find lying between the beams which supported the flooring were a small copper box. In it were a neatly folded vellum document, which were about 20 lines of writing. Both Anderson and Jensen, who proved to be something of a paleographer, were much excited by this discovery, which promised to afford the key to these extraordinary phenomena. I possess a copy of an astrological work which I have never read. It has, by way of a frontispiece, a woodcut by Anne Sebald Bairn, representing a number of sages seated around a table. This table detail may enable connoisseurs to identify the book. I cannot myself recollect its title, and it is not at the moment within reach, but the flower leaves of it are covered with writing, and during the 10 years in which I have owned this volume, I have not been able to determine which way up this writing ought to be read, much less in what language it is. Not dissimilar with the position of Anderson and Jensen after the protracted examination to which they submitted the document in the copper box. After 2 days' contemplation of it, Jensen, who was the bolder spirit of the two, hazarded the conjecture that the language were either Latin or Old Danish. Anderson ventured upon no surmises, and were very willing to surrender the box and the parchment to the Historical Society of Warburg, to be placed in their museum. I had the whole story from him a few months later, as we sat in the wood near Uppsala, after a visit to the library there, where we, or rather I, had laughed over the contract by which Daniel Sultanus, and later Laughed Professor of Hebrew at Königsberg, sold himself to Satan. Anderson were not really amused. "Young idiot," he said, meaning Sulthenius, who were only an undergraduate when he committed that indiscretion. How did he know what company we was courting? When I suggested the usual considerations, he only grunted. That same afternoon he told me what you have read, but refused to draw any inferences from it, and will assent to any that I drew from him, or drew for him. That's the end of number 13. That's an interesting little story, isn't it? I'm trying to think what to say about it, really. And there's good historical context here, and the examination of the church is interesting from a historical standpoint. But what really strikes me here is that the ghost in question isn't a person's ghost, or at least it's not when there's a person attached to it, but it's an haunted room, a room that only appears by night, which takes up physical space. It's not like it's a magical space that appears there. This room comes into being and expands and takes over part of the other rooms, which you can tell by the fact that the missing windows is the big thing, but just a sense of smallness. It's a very strange sort of haunting to have. Rearranges the architecture of the building. And well, I mean, presumably this house, or the Golden Lion, is the house which the bishop was hosting this fellow who is supposed to have been sort of an evil sorcerer, but I don't know, it makes for a very strange little piece of occurrence. I don't know, really. This one had such a strong narrative running through that I'm more inclined to feel like this one is a fictionalised piece, because there's some very clear narrative elements, the foreshadowing of the room being smaller at night, and the choice of room and all this, but I don't know, again, I'm curious as to whether M.R. James just collected accounts, because this could be an account being told to him by someone. I mean, it's framed as an account being told to him by someone, but I just don't know. I think the copper box and the piece of parchment are interesting. Obviously, the implication there at the end there is a contract through which a man sells his soul to the devil. But I don't know. I mean, the thing that gets me about a lot of these stories, but this one especially, really, I think, is there's not really an answer to the mystery, is there? Like, it's just a weird thing that happened, and then it'd be over. Like, they found this document, presumably the haunting stopped, and that's the long and short of it. They couldn't figure out what it was. There are a few little crumbs, but yeah, there's nothing to it. It makes it feel like a very authentic sort of haunting, doesn't it? Because that's what would happen realistically, right? You come across a ghost that's manifested in a weird way. You have to figure out what's going on, get rid of it, and then once you got rid of it, you don't dig around anymore. It's done with, right? especially if you're a person who is involved in sort of spirituality and has concerns about your mortal soul on that. I don't know. I mean, I say that this is very much constructed like a, like a narrative. There are some elements of it, but that's in the way it's told more than the actual events. The events read very true to me. That's what I like about the James stories. None of them really feel like, you know, something that's written purely to be a ghost story, purely to sort of scare and horrify you. Because like they all generally come to the point of there's one horrible thing that is discovered or investigated, and then once it's resolved, people stop looking into it. It feels like a very authentic sort of accounting of stories about ghosts, because that's what people would do. I'm really torn about this. I need to do more research into them, but I just don't have a good method to do it. But yeah. And on cue, as always, we seem to be running into some technical difficulties at the end here, which I think is just due to the lamp tells me that he will, well, he's not going to stop burning more oil, but he's going to reduce the amount of it tomorrow, because apparently the demonic incursion has been mostly eradicated, and he will reduce it, so hopefully it shouldn't be as much of a problem going forward. But I do need to upgrade, or well, he needs to upgrade the infrastructure in here, but he expects me to be the one to contribute to it somehow. Lord knows how. Still, hopefully it won't be necessary going forward to happen again, and if it is, we'll make do somehow, I'm sure. But yeah, as always, thank you anyone who is still here for sticking around with me, and for anyone who has stopped by here, which I know at least 2 of you did. I appreciate anyone who has watched this after the fact as well. I know quite a lot of people do watch these after the fact. And that's about the long and short of it, really. Yeah. Probably no stream tomorrow. Which I've got to be better at promoting this, but on Sunday we're doing Fugi Theatre, where myself, Discipline, Plague, Avriz and Layla are going to be doing some live theatre. We've got a bunch of monologues picked out and then some one-act plays, which we'll be running through. And so I want to make sure my voice is good and rested for that. Which, yeah. I'm going to kill you. You come here in my stream. No, you can't be making actual threats. I'm sorry, I'm so used to being, you know, just a rat. I'm like, yeah, I can just threaten to kill someone. That's not a thing you're allowed to do online among humans. But, no, I'm not going to kill you. I am, however, going to, enact a curse upon your bloodline that will unmake all of your happy days and render you a wretched screaming ball of, I don't know. Can robots suffer? If robots can't suffer, I'm going to find a way to make you suffer, and then I'm going to make you suffer, is what I'll say. I'm definitely not going to do any crimes in the completionist task. Oh yeah, I was shilling my VOD theatre project, which is on Sunday. I'm going to take tomorrow off to rest my voice, just in case, because I've arranged a bunch of people and I don't want to fail for them. But yeah, that will be at 5 PM EST, which is best as I can recollect is around about 10 PM GMT, which is when I normally stream. So I do encourage you to stop by for that. It should be a good time. But yeah, that's Sunday, nothing tomorrow. And then Tuesday, I think I'm still going to be going on with my Torah Tuesdays thing, where I'll read whatever chat tells me. So stop by for that, and it'll be a good time. Other than that, yeah, I don't think I've got really much else to say. Thank you for... You're very welcome, Abby. Thank you for stopping by, and apparently stay on the old time, which I do very much appreciate. Yeah, I feel like I should have like a little sign-off message or something, but I just don't. I appreciate you being here. We'll do more of these in the future. I'd probably stay and do another story now if I wasn't, you know, having all these problems. But yeah, I do genuinely enjoy reading to all you people, and I appreciate that you are here to listen to it. Anyway, as always, I do wish you an happy rest of your day, however long that is or whatever time it might be for you. And until next we speak, ta-ra.